They called me fragile once, the kind of girl who smiled too easily and cried into her pillow when men left. They were wrong. I learned, piece by piece, that fragility is only a label people pin on what they don't want to understand. My name is Sophia. I used to believe in easy things. In love that fit like a warm glove, in promises whispered between coffee cups, in the polite geometry of a life plan together. I believed Lucas. Lucas had a laugh that could make me forget the shape of my hands. He had a way of using the word always like a soft instrument. I will always, we always, you always, as if language could anchor us. He was the kind of man who carried kindness like a coat and wore it everywhere. He was also, as I discovered later, clever in other, more dangerous ways. Clever enough to build an alibi and hollow out trust like a carpenter hollowing a chair. This is not a story with a hook and a clean ending. This is the chest of tools I used until my hands no longer trembled. The accounting of a woman who decided that survival was not enough. I wanted vindication. I wanted him to understand, in a way that didn't require me to shout, what he had broken. It began with a photograph. I found it on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of languid syrup-light day when the city felt soft and our apartment felt like a promise. I was cleaning. Lucas was in the kitchen, humming, a shuffling of pans and a kettle. I lingered over the bedroom, a small retreat with high windows. He kept his phone face down on our dresser. He always did. I had learned long ago, not to rifle through his things. Boundaries are delicate. But that day, my hand brushed his screen as I lifted a jewelry box and his phone lit with a notification. A messenger app flashed. Someone's name I didn't know. I rationalized. A client? A friend? The message preview suggested nothing scandalous. Then the photograph appeared, a thumbnail that should have been meaningless but felt like a blade. Lucas, the corner of his mouth lifted, arms around a woman with a laugh I recognized instantly because it was the kind of laugh he used to reserve for me. They were close. Too close. The caption, a string of emojis and a timestamp, made heat rush up my neck like guilt. I clicked. The image loaded. The smile, the hand on the small of her back, the way his eyes narrowed when he looked at that woman. It was intimate. Not the strange, careless intimacy that can happen at parties. This was deliberate proximity, a private joke. A betrayal. I didn't cry at first. My vision went narrow like a lens. Anger is an incision. It separates the patient part of you from the rest. My heart didn't race with panic. It thudded an even, cold rhythm. I put the phone back where I had found it and watched the kettle boil as if the sound would tell me what to do next. You would think breaking into a relationship's castle of small rituals, the couch, the grocery lists, the shared toothbrush cup, would be simple. It is not. There is choreography to betrayal. It must be orchestrated with care to be unmasked. I could have confronted him, thrown the picture on his chest like a gauntlet. I could have shrieked. Instead, I began to listen. I listened to the ways he spoke when he thought no one was listening. The way he said my name to the dog, the way he made certain sounds in the night that were not mine. I listened to the cadence of his calls, the hours he suddenly started staying late, the faint perfume that slipped into our blankets like a comment. I gathered facts like a miser collects coins, each one small and cold and yielding to calculation. My life before Lucas was uncomplicated. I worked at a gallery that sold other people's heartbreaks framed and labeled. I loved color and texture and the way a room could be coaxed into confession. Lucas had been a photographer who loved to call things honest. That's how he sold himself. Honest, reliable, luminous. He was, in the beginning, the kind of man who would stay behind at openings to ask questions about a woman's brushwork. He also, at the end, became a man who hid his phone in pockets I didn't know existed. Finding the photograph flicked on an animal intelligence in me that had lain quiet. I began with small, safe tests, a message I typed and didn't send, a casual question about a colleague that he brushed off, a name slipped in conversation. He deflected each time, a magician revealing nothing of the trick. The woman in the photograph had a name. Mara. I discovered that from a comment on one of his old posts. Amazing shot, Mara. Someone had written. My throat closed. I didn't look at his social media often. Lucas liked to keep certain platforms curated. But paranoia has a hunger of its own. I created a fake account, a small, harmless thing, a ghost with no history, and began to watch. Watching is intimate. It feels like drinking other people's coffee. I looked at the photos. Dinners, alleyways lit like theater, Mara's profile saturated with the kind of glamour that comes from being seen. The comments were a mosaic of attention. Likes, hearts, and once, Lucas's name under a flurry of maybe 3-word exchanges. They were careful, codified. The messages between them were not public, of course, but patterns whispered. They both liked images with similar filters. They both used the same set of phrases. Patterns form a map. I booked 2 flights in a week and spent the time between them building an arsenal. Legal advice for what I might expose, a private investigator's rate card, I didn't hire one. I liked the intimacy of uncovering things myself, and a notebook. The notebook became my altar. I wrote down times and dates, what he wore the night he came home late, the peculiar way he tensed his left hand when he lied. I traced his movements like lines on a map until the map began to resemble a routing for a siege. I am not ashamed to say I became good at surveillance. There's a cold artistry to it. Sitting in a car, the engine off, the city breathing, waiting for the form of a man to emerge, leaning against a lamppost and counting the seconds until a door opened, tracing the scent of perfume on a scarf like a detective in an old novel. My neighbors thought I was writing a novel. Maybe I was. Novel writing requires patience. So does revenge. The more I watched, the more the truth unfurled in small, incontestable ways. Lucas met Mara in the evenings at galleries and under the pretext of reviewing prints. He called it work. He took photographs that he never showed me. He came home with receipts for late-night eateries and the occasional envelope with foreign postage. There were lies that were laughable in their banality. The famed team dinner that had been 2 people in a cramped studio. It was not only her. There were, I would later learn, other women. Not a constellation, but constellations do not matter to a heart as much as the fact of infidelity itself. The arithmetic of infidelity is cruel. 1 + 1 is always more than 2 when measuring consequence. The details collected themselves into a damning dossier that made my throat feel like concrete. I knew I could destroy him in 1,000 ways. I could drag him into a public shame I would later tire of. Instead, I wanted to dismantle him piece by piece in a manner both precise and irrevocable. People imagine revenge as an explosion, lipstick on the collar, a dramatic scene in a restaurant. Those are delicious, cinematic, and ultimately ephemeral. I wanted more than ephemeral. I wanted a slow unmaking that would leave him with nothing but the clarity that he had been exactly what I accused him of being. He needed to wake up in a world where his own choices were the mirror he could not avoid. So I started with what I knew he prized. His reputation. Lucas's work sold on a quiet, hungry circuit. Collectors, magazines, whispers. He loved being called a promising talent. He was charming in interviews. He would say things like, "I like to capture what people are too tired to show." He said it as if it were a moral precept. I would turn that sentence into a noose. I wrote a letter. Not a letter for him. A letter for the editors, for the gallery owners, for the art blogs that had once praised him. I wrote it with care and restraint, the way someone pruning a rose bush keeps their hands steady even as they cut. I recorded dates of double-booked shows. I enclosed thin, verifiable evidence, receipts, a photograph of Lucas leaving a hotel. Nothing crude, nothing explicit. I offered it to people who mattered in small, unobtrusive ways, anonymous and precise. The letter was the first chisel. Reputation corrodes faster than people think when the suggestion of impropriety smells true. Editors are hungry for drama because drama sells. A gallery director I had once befriended, what an unexpected weapon friendship can be, read my note and called. It began as a quiet inquiry and became an internal review. Lucas felt the first tremor beneath his feet. He called me in the night and asked me, with that pleading I'd grown to distrust, whether I had spoken to anyone. "No," I said. The word tasted like the first crack of ice on a pond. My voice didn't tremble. I had rehearsed 1,000 times the art of sounding wounded but composed. He believed me. Of course he did. People believe the faces they want to be true. He grew paranoid. Paranoia is a brilliant engine because it makes people self-destructive. He began to slip. The photographs he posted were clumsy, staged. He called less often. When he did, his voice was measured, suspicious. I answered calmly, with the kind of coolness that sits on top of a bonfire waiting to be fed. I let him swim in his guesses and watch as he flailed. While his professional life frayed at the edges, I worked on his private life. This is where I confessed to a certain cruelty. I began to occupy the space he once took for granted. I made our apartment into a museum of our past, but curated as if I were a collector of errors. I left small traces of his infidelity for him to find. A lipstick on a napkin placed in a book he would take with him, a receipt from the same restaurant where he'd met Mara, folded and slipped into his briefcase. I did not shout. I did not smear him in public. I let breadcrumbs of truth accumulate until they became a trail impossible to ignore. There was, inevitably, a confrontation. He found one of the receipts on a Thursday morning. His face a map of fresh horror, as if someone had drawn a place on him and pointed. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, as if I had thrown a stone through a window and he were surprised it had broken glass inside his own house. "Because you taught me how to watch," I said. "Because you thought you could build a private life inside our home." His answer was a manuscript of excuses. He said he was confused, that it had meant nothing, that the women were problems he'd solve. He said everything guilty people say. I listened and let the air compress. I wanted him to feel the dense gravity of his choices. Then the next stage. Exposure with an artistry to it. I did not want to ruin his life by theft or violence. I wanted the pure arithmetic of truth to do the work. I gathered receipts, messages, the photograph, the patterns. I compiled them into a dossier the way a scholar compiles sources, with footnotes and dates and an index. I mailed copies to 3 places. The gallery representing Lucas, a magazine that had touted him as a rising star, and Mara. Mara's address was the thin red thread that tied it together. I sent her an email that was not cruel but precise. I wrote, plainly, that Lucas had been dishonest. I attached nothing inflammatory. I offered to meet. Her reply was a sharp, short message. She had suspected. She had not known the other women. She had her own life complicated by doubt. She said she didn't know what to do with the information, but that she would think about it. I was, for a moment, surprised by how much I wanted her to feel the same ache I felt. Then I remembered, I had outgrown wanting. I wanted him to know. I wanted others to know. I wanted him to suffer the loss of the narrative he had constructed. The gallery, the magazine, the editors, they handle the documents the way they handle art, with the gravity of people who adore narrative. Anonymous tips have the perfume of scandal. They hover in the air like moths. Emails were followed by quiet phone calls, which led to meetings. Lucas was invited in for questions, and he stumbled, because a man who has been hiding will always trip on honesty when it is suddenly demanded of him. He lost clients. He lost features. He lost the gentle glow of future offers. He stroked his bruises in private, bewildered at the scale his life had acquired. I watched him shrink into small spaces. It was an awful necessary thing. But the public unraveling was only part of what I wanted. Revenge tastes better, I had decided, when it is personal. So I arranged something simple. A party. Not a party for our circle. Not one where screams would be heard. A small gathering of people who had known us, mutual friends, a couple of collectors, a curator who had once taken a chance on Lucas. I sent the invitations with a casualness that came from practice. I told myself it was for closure. It was not. The night of the party, I wore the dress he had liked on me. The navy silk that made my collarbones look like geography. I was careful with my hair, slow with my makeup. I did not want drama. I wanted the texture of the evening to be immaculate. I moved through the room like someone cataloging objects. I introduced people, laughed in the proper places, and let Lucas do what he did best. Charm an audience into believing the version of him he preferred. Halfway through, I excused myself and retreated to the study where, in a training of patience and guile, I had set the stage. On the table lay the small, innocuous items I had compiled. Printed messages, photographs, and a voice memo that recorded a conversation where Lucas had been reckless and unguarded. The memo was not explicit. It was a man being himself, boasting, vulnerable, dismissive. I had it transcribed and annotated. I picked up my phone, walked back into the living room, and found Lucas telling a story. People were leaning in because that was the scent he wore. I placed my palm lightly against his shoulder and said, "Lucas, could I have everyone's attention for a moment? It is astounding how quickly a room quiets when a woman asks for something with the wrong kind of calm." I spoke plainly. I laid out the facts with the clarity of someone who had done her homework. I did not raise my voice. My voice was the surface of a lake, and the words were stones dropped into it. The stones created rings. The room watched as the narrative unfolded. The receipts, the photographs, the double bookings. Mara was there, not dramatic, but measured. She had come not for spectacle but to stand. When I finished, the silence was a visible thing. Lucas stood a little too quickly, and looked like a man trying to put on an armor that had been removed in private. He sputtered apologies. He asked for forgiveness. He tried, in that moment, to make himself smaller and larger at the same time. People who had once admired him looked at him differently. Not in the way lovers look at traitors, but in the way colleagues look at someone whose currency has been revealed as counterfeit. I could have delivered a blow there. Screamed, called him names, dragged him into eternity. Instead I walked away. I had them. I had the evidence. I had the center of gravity of his life shifted. He would not so easily step back to the life he had before. That was victory enough. But victory is unsatisfying if it tastes of ashes. I craved something else. The cleansing of truth that does not require spectacle but carries finality. So I did what I had to do. I removed him. Not physically. I removed him from the narrative we had built together. I sold the apartment. The decision felt like the cleanest of gestures. Simple, irreversible. He came home one morning to find a letter on his pillow. An offer accepted, a lawyer's stamp. I told him I was leaving, that this life we had constructed would be a relic. He begged. He promised. He tried to bribe and to bargain. He told me about his childhood, his father, the reasons he had strayed. Men always have reasons. They are like maps showing streets that lead away from responsibility. I moved out the week after, carrying only what could fit in 2 suitcases and a heart that had learned to measure pain with practical metrics. I left him the photographs he loved and the lights that made his frames glow. If this sounds cruel, it was necessary. The absence of pageantry in my actions was the point. Humiliation was not the objective, recalibration was. Years passed in a rhythm of reconstruction. I rented a small flat with tall windows and a kitchen that flooded in the morning. I taught photography night classes at the community center and framed works for a modest living. My life, once wound tight around someone else's orbit, found a new axis. The small victories, a friend who became an honest companion, a student who learned to see light, were stitches. Yet the thing about revenge is that it never leaves you unmarked. It leaves you with a certain sharpened edge. There were nights I woke with the image of Lucas's face, not as a villain but as a human being who had chosen his own ruin. I was not unfeeling. I had loved and been loved, not honestly, but in pieces that had felt real then. Love and hate are not opposites. They are both combustion engines. I had lit a fire in myself that would not wholly cool. Then, one autumn afternoon, years after our fracture, I saw him in a cafe window across the street. He looked older in the way experience makes faces more legible. He had a small unpublished book in his lap, a self-published volume of photographs with a thin, earnest dedication. He seemed smaller, honest in a way that had nothing to do with charm. He caught my eye and for a moment, we were 2 actors frozen between scenes. He stood and came over. "You look well," he said, and in his voice was an apology that had not been crafted for a room. It was private. "So do you," I said. I wondered briefly if he would ask to take me back into some arrangement. He did not. He looked at me, and the look was a dictionary unfolding. Regret, acknowledgement, perhaps an admission of his own smallness. "Have you forgiven me?" he asked, because even now he sought absolution that would not cost him much. "I don't know if forgiveness is a currency we trade anymore," I answered. "But I wanted you to know, I won't spend the rest of my life proving it." "You punished me," he said. The sentence was blunt. He did not say if punishment felt fair. "I lost everything." "You chose your path," I said. "I chose mine." He sat down, the way someone sits down only when they are ready to be honest. "Do you ever regret how you went about it?" The question surprised me, because I had been thinking about regret like one thinks about weather, inevitable, sometimes torrential. "Sometimes," I admitted. "It changed me. But I had to stop being small for myself." We talked for an hour. It was a conversation like the slow turning of a key. He told me about the emptiness of applause without integrity, about the scarcity of trust once it is spent. I told him about the quiet mornings, about the students who finally saw the light in their photographs. There was no reconciliation in our talk. Reconciliation requires a mutual architecture, and we had only ruins. But there was a new kind of peace. The one that comes from the recognition that both of us had been teachers to each other. He taught me how not to trust, and I taught him perhaps the cost of not. I left that cafe with the smell of coffee and rain. People say revenge is hollow. They are sometimes right. For me, it was not about emptiness. It was about calibration. I did not want to become the kind of person who defines herself by what was done to her. I wanted my life to be a counterweight. Do I recommend it? No. There is a dignity in walking away without carving monuments to the hurt you carry. But beneath the veneer of calm civility, there are people made of slow combustions, and sometimes those combustions require an audience. I chose mine carefully. This is the last thing I will tell you. Vengeance is not a place you arrive at so much as a state of mind you pass through. It does not make you invincible. It does make you exact. It taught me to notice the architecture of lies and the engineering of small reassurances. It made me precise about what I would accept in a life and what I would refuse. And when I think of Lucas now, I see a man who once used softness to shield a rot. I see, too, a woman who learned to build herself out of light and restraint and the uncompromising insistence that the person she loved, and loved her in return, would not be the one who taught her how to disappear. If there is any poetry in this story, it is not of triumph over another but of triumph over inertia. There was a point when I could have crumbled into the role they'd given me. The wounded woman, the sad, ornamental thing. Instead I learned to carve. I learned to remove what did not belong to me. And in doing so, I found a life that did not require his shadow to exist. My name is Sophia. I once loved a man who betrayed me. I once taught myself to be dangerous. I won, not because the world applauded, but because I learned a new language for truth. And finally, at last, I spoke it aloud. They say revenge is a door you close behind you. They don't tell you how long the handle stays warm in your palm. My name is Sophia. I moved out, sold the apartment, and folded my life down to 2 suitcases. Dark jeans, a navy silk dress, a set of tools you can't buy in a store, timing, silence, and the appetite to look someone in the eye until they blink. I wanted a life that didn't hum to the frequency of Lucas's laugh. I wanted to test whether victory changes the pitch of your own voice. It does. Quietly. 1. The new room. I rented a flat over a bakery on Renwick, the kind of street where dawn smells like yeast and possibility. The windows were tall. The walls, clean. I laid down a rug that didn't carry history. My furniture arrived second-hand and patient. A steel drafting table, an ashwood chair, a lamp that turned any room into a confession booth. By day, I took over an evening program at a community art center and then, through a chain of favors, a university extension class called How to See Light. I taught amateurs, nurses, bus drivers, a widower named Arun who apologized every time he focused. How to not be fooled by glare. Light lies, I'd tell them. But it leaves fingerprints. The students wrote this down like it was scripture. Maybe it was. By night, I built a business out of other people's blind spots. Not private investigation. Not exactly. The email address on my card said I consulted on reputation hydration for creatives and small galleries, crisis optics, narrative audits, harm minimization. I told clients where the lies lived in their bios and how to salt away truth for when they needed it. I didn't fabricate. I rearranged. There's a difference. The galleries paid in invoices that said, strategy. You can call it manipulation. I call it literacy. 2. Adrian. Adrian Hale arrived on a cold Tuesday with a portfolio so meticulous it could perform surgery. He was not handsome in any classic sense. He was articulate, made of angles, green-eyed, the sort of man who remembered to ask a question and wait for the full answer. He had a reputation for long essays that made artists sound like they were testifying in their own defense. He wrote for Vast, a magazine that had quietly stepped back from Lucas after my letters did their work. He came to the community classroom as a guest speaker and stayed because he liked the way I critiqued without cruelty. After, he asked if I'd consult on an essay about the invisible labor of women in the art economy. Framers, handlers, co-creators who never got wall text. I said yes. We met in public places, then in my kitchen, then in the kind of silence that has the texture of certainty. He did not ask about Lucas. People who can spotlight's biases learn not to interrogate shadows. He asked about how I knew what I knew. Pattern memory, I told him. You can predict any storm if you've mapped the last 10. Teach me that, he said. Not as a challenge. As an apprenticeship. I gave him my notebook's architecture without names. How to build a timeline that doesn't wobble, how to trace money as if it were a river, how to distinguish contrition from strategy. He called my methods elegant. I called them necessary. When he kissed me, it was after a seminar where my students showed their final projects and I let myself believe that building might become my first language again. He tasted like winter apples and a promise he hadn't rehearsed. We took it slow, not as a pose but as a discipline. And yet, the body remembers siege even in a safe room. My hands stayed near the door. 3. The ask. The email subject line read, "Quiet favor. Urgent." It was from a curator named Delphine who once installed an exhibit with me at 3 in the morning and fed me almonds from her pocket. The favor had a name, Horizon Trust, a philanthropic engine disguised as a lighthouse. They funded grants in the arts and education. They also apparently ran on other kinds of currents, whispers of predatory contracts, silencing NDAs, awards that circumvented people who asked the wrong questions. I wasn't a journalist. I wasn't a cop. But corruption is just a personality type with a budget, and I was tired of watching it curate what the city called taste. Delphine asked me to evaluate a call for proposals that looked rigged. She wanted proof. "Do you want to expose them?" I asked on the phone. "I want to stop them from deciding what beauty looks like in this city," she said. I don't kid myself. I don't work for justice. I work for accuracy. But sometimes these overlap like eclipses. I told her I'd look. She asked my rate. I told her to donate it to my class scholarship fund and send me the receipts. The Horizon Trust board chair was a man named Victor Hale. No relation to Adrian. Different bone structure. Different weather. Victor liked to say he elevated unheard voices. He also liked to terminate grants mid-cycle if artists declined partnership opportunities that looked suspiciously like branding. I recognized the breed. Benevolence as a mask that fits too well. I spent 2 weeks crawling through filings, donor lists, and the memoirs of people who'd been praised and then quietly punished. It was exhilarating, like picking a lock with the right tension. Patterns emerged, grants awarded to artists who then ceded reproduction rights far beyond normal scope. A network of independent reviewers who shared a single accountant. A side company that harvested data from applications to build demographic portfolios for luxury donors. It wasn't illegal. It was obscene. I could have pitched the findings to a reporter. Instead, I designed a performance. 4. Mara returns. Mara messaged me at 1:13 a.m. exactly. We never closed the circle. Can we speak? Years earlier, she had been the woman in Lucas's photograph. Now she was directing a residency in a converted textile mill upstate, making films about work and desire where nobody was the villain unless they insisted. We met in a diner with napkins that felt like paper promises. She didn't apologize. She didn't need to. That part of our story had calcified into something we didn't owe each other anymore. I got your name from Delphine, she said. I heard you're building something that scares men who mistake patronage for ownership. On a good day, I said. She slid over a folder like a pianist testing a key, emails from Horizon Trust staff suggesting she cast a donor's niece in her new film. Then when she refused, a flurry of logistical slowdowns that made the production bleed money. I can weather this, she said, but my residents can't. I was told you could make this stop without burning the building down. I don't believe in clean warfare. But I believe in proportional response. I can make them choose between the cost of their methods and the cost of changing them, I said. Mara looked at me the way people look at cliff edges. Curious, cautious, grateful for the view. And what do you need? Your patience, I said. And your consent when I test the electric fence. She nodded. Take it. 5. The knife and the mirror. Adrian didn't flinch when I told him I was going to engineer a controlled detonation at Horizon. He offered to help and then, notably, asked me how to help without becoming the story. I handed him the scaffolding. Write about invisible labor around philanthropic grants. Keep the names until the story could hold the weight. We mapped actors on a wall. Victor, his deputy, a fixer named Colleen with a surgeon's comm, 3 independent reviewers who were anything but. We mapped vulnerabilities. Victor's public hunger for moral authority, Colleen's preference for text over calls, the reviewer's side incomes that required plausible deniability to survive. If you push the right joint in the right way, an edifice shifts. I drafted 3 letters. One from a coalition of grantees, real people, real signatures, stating they would not sign the new rights grab addendum and would publish it if asked again. Another from a tech privacy nonprofit, asking pointed questions about Horizon's applicant data pipeline. The last from a major donors council, expressing concern about reputational risk and seeking assurances that the trust's practices aligned with best-in-class philanthropic standards. The donors council did not know they had written the letter. It was crafted from their past language, filed as a public records query that would appear on the docket before anyone could deny its existence. Legal optics have a way of manifesting reality. Then I waited. Waiting is part of the work. The bakery downstairs started making plum galettes. The city steamed and cooled. My students learned how to use the tripod without apology. I got what I needed sooner than planned. Colleen sent a stern email to all reviewers reminding them to retain discretion as always, and, beautifully recklessly, attached a PDF of the rights addendum with track changes showing Victor's edits, complete with a note in the margin. We can get away with this. Artists want the check more than control. Cruelty always writes in the present tense. It thinks the future won't read. 6. The dinner. The controlled detonation took the form of a funder's dinner for the trust. Long tables, overwatered flowers, a string quartet performing songs luxury people pretend not to recognize. Delphine got me in as a guest's +1. I wore the navy dress again, a quiet invocation and a reminder to myself. Objects don't carry curses, people do. Victor's keynote was an aria about civic duty. Adrian stood near the bar, notepad in his pocket, listening, anonymous as a shadow that happened to be handsome. Mara arrived late with the deliberate poise of someone who knows they'll be asked to smile and has already chosen when. On my cue. For things happened within the same minute. Delphine's gallery posted a letter, properly lawyered, declining a Horizon grant until the trust clarified its rights practices. The privacy nonprofit tweeted a thread with examples of applicant data fields that had nothing to do with art but everything to do with profiling. A coalition of grantees published their sign-on letter, not angry but firm, with a copy of the track changes PDF embedded and redacted only for emails. Adrian, who had kept his powder dry, published a pre-written essay on Vast about the cost of generosity, quoting nobody at Horizon and everyone they had ever ignored. The room felt it, like a pressure change before a storm. Phones lit up. Victor's face tried 6 shapes. Colleen, 3 steps behind him, stilled. She was the kind of woman who could suture an artery with a paperclip, but even surgeons bleed when the floor tilts. Victor made his way to me as if he had a claim on gravity. You, he said, smiling as if we had an old joke. You've caused us some turbulence. No, I said. Your practices did. I opened a window. He lowered his voice. This is reckless. Reckless is pretending ownership is philanthropy, I said. Reckless is thinking artists can't read revisions. You're very certain for someone with no money on the line, he said. You're very certain for someone who has only money on the line, I said back. We are taught to be polite when men perform disappointment at us. I've unlearned that. Victor said something about partnership. I handed him a printed one-pager, a new rights policy modeled on the only decent one in the industry, drafted with lawyers who weren't afraid of daylight. Adopt it, I said. Publicly. Or watch your donor pipeline learn the word extraction in ways that make their grandchildren uncomfortable. He laughed short. Is this blackmail? It's design, I said. But if you prefer a different word, consequence works. He left to speak with counsel. Counsel had already read the letters, the thread, the essay. Counsel's job is to make cost-benefit look like inevitability. By dessert, Victor looked like a man learning the limits of his own charisma. Colleen gave me a nod that wasn't respect and wasn't resentment. Something else. Recognition, maybe, a woman seeing the shape of another woman's uncompromising. 7. Light studies. Hostilities do not end with a dessert spoon. They end with paperwork. 2 weeks later, Horizon issued a statement that used 7 paragraphs to say I was right without saying my name. They adopted the policy almost exactly as drafted, installed an independent data officer, and offered reinstatements to projects they had starved. It wasn't contrition. It was calculus. I accept both when they fix the harm. They called me to ask for a meeting. I brought Mara and Delphine. Victor brought a bottle of water he never opened. We didn't hug. We drafted a memorandum of understanding while the city yawned outside. Colleen didn't speak until the end. Then to me privately, You will never take our money. No, I said. But I'll take your change. On the walk out, Mara squeezed my shoulder. You didn't burn the building, she said. You turned on the exit signs. I'm learning to choose my fires, I said. It sounded like prophecy and also like a decent life. 8. Adrian's question. There's a specific quiet that lands after a campaign like that ends. Your body, revved for months, misses the broadcast of threat. In the quiet, you hear questions that had waited their turn. Adrian cooked me dinner. Pasta with capers and the kind of patience you can taste. Midway through, he asked, are you building a life or a portfolio of enemies? The former, I said and meant it. The latter is a side effect. He took my hand. I love your mind. I also love your pulse. I want both to keep time with something that won't kill you. I'm not reckless, I said. I didn't say you were, he said. I said I want your work to include you. He wasn't telling me to stop. He was asking me to look for the line where vigilance curdles into self-erasure. It was a good question. It hovered over the table like steam. Later in bed, he pressed his forehead to mine and said, Don't mistake me for a man who wants to soften you. I know exactly what kind of man you are, I said. And I know what kind of woman I am. We'll build a room where both fit. 9. The counter move. A month of calm. Then a postcard appeared in my mailbox with no return address. A photograph of a disused pier. On the back, a note in a neat, humorless hand. You step out of line, expect a push. Threats are often inventory lists of a coward's imagination. Still, I took it seriously. I catalogued who might want to rattle me, a reviewer who lost a side income, a donor whose niece never got her role, a former student I had graded too honestly, Lucas. It wasn't Lucas. He had retreated to small shows, clean boundaries. We had seen each other twice since the cafe. He had started volunteering at a re-entry photography program and spoke about it like he'd removed a stone from his shoe and finally noticed he could walk. I traced the postcard to a print shop used by the Trust's PR firm. Not proof. Proximity. I let the information sit. Then I built a little theater. I announced a public workshop at the community center called Light, Power, and Consent. How photographs take and give. I invited artists who'd been exploited and a grant officer from a foundation that actually behaved. I also invited, via a generic mailing list I knew they scraped, everyone at the PR firm. Then I waited to see which shadow moved. On the day, a man I'd never seen took a seat in the back row and pretended to be bored. People who intend harm think boredom makes them unnoticed. I photographed the audience in the opening minutes, as part of the workshop's exercise on mutual consent in public space. I asked everyone to sign a release or raise a hand to opt out. The man didn't raise his hand. He didn't sign. He had a choice. He made one. After the session, I approached him. You didn't sign, I said. He shrugged. Public event. Yes, I said. And consent matters even there. I held his gaze a beat longer than polite. He blinked first. There it was, the push, aborted by eye contact. I never used the photograph publicly. I sent it to the PR firm with the subject line, Visitor at a consent workshop. Who sent him? No accusation. Just a mirror. They responded within 10 minutes. A panicked apology for a junior associate overstepping, complete with a screenshot of a memo reminding staff to clear attendance with legal. The associate was CC'd and wrote a note that smelled like fear. I didn't want him fired. I wanted the firm to learn the price of spooking people who know how to read light. They did. 10. The student. Her name was Ella, 19, mouth full of wire braces and ambition. She'd taken 2 buses to the class because photography was the only time the voices in my head go quiet, her words, delivered with the offhand precision of someone used to not being believed. She shot with a borrowed Pentax and a hunger I recognized from my own beginning. One evening she stayed after, agitated and excited, showing me screenshots of a DM from a famous street photographer who'd offered to mentor her in exchange for being a little brave. She had Googled him. The results did not tell a full horror story, only the outline of one. I asked her if the messages were ongoing. She nodded, embarrassed like she'd invited the rain. I asked for consent to intervene. She gave it without theatrics. I don't rescue, I told myself. I recalibrate. But some recalibrations feel like pulling a person out of a current they didn't notice until they were already half submerged. I asked Adrian to draft a short, devastating paragraph on mentorship boundaries for Vast. I compiled lightly redacted messages from 3 other women the man had DM'd with the same script. I sent the whole packet to the agency that booked his speaking gigs along with a list of reputable mentorship programs with codes of conduct and actual oversight. The agency cut ties within a week. The man posted an apology shaped like fog. Ella sold her Pentax to buy a used Nikon and made photographs under streetlights that looked like proof of life. When she hugged me after her first group show, I felt something unclench in my sternum I didn't know I'd been clenching. Maybe this is what winning looks like when you stop thinking about applause. 11. Lucas. Reframed. Lucas asked to meet in a park where old men argue about soccer and toddlers hoard pebbles like currency. He brought a thermos of tea and a humility that didn't itch. I heard about what you did with Horizon, he said. People aren't saying your name, but they're using your language. Good, I said. I wanted to tell you I'm learning to photograph without the performance. It's harder. It's better. I'm glad, I said. He looked at me in a way that no longer asked for absolution or attention, just witness. Do you ever wish we'd done it differently? I wish we'd been different people, I said. But then I wouldn't be me. He smiled. You were always you. I was playing a part that didn't fit. We didn't shake hands. We didn't promise anything. We left with the odd piece of people who have survived each other and found separate ground. 12. The room we build. Adrian left a toothbrush at my place, then a sweater, then a question about a lease that sounded like a proposal without pageantry. We talked about houses like they were essays. Structure, light, where to put the messy middle. We made a rule. No secrets, only pacing. I told him everything he needed to know about the woman I became when cornered. He told me everything I needed to know about the boy he had been when ignored. We didn't fix each other. We built a room where the worst parts could stand without running the others out. One night, he woke me to show me a headline. Vast had won an award for a package he'd edited, stories about care work in the arts economy. He refused to center himself in his acceptance speech. He thanked the women whose labor had been footnotes. He thanked the person who taught me to look for where power hides. He didn't say my name. I didn't need him to. After, we walked home quietly, the city soft with first snow. Does this feel like an ending? He asked. No, I said. It feels like a correct comma. 13. The last performance. People kept asking me to keynote things. I declined most of them. Speeches calcify what should stay weather. But I said yes to one. A small, stubborn festival founded by a librarian who had once sold her grandmother's ring to keep the doors open for a final month. The theme was what we keep. I wrote the talk longhand because my laptop felt like a mediator I hadn't hired. I wrote about the dignity of refusal, the politics of light, the ethics of attention. I wrote about revenge, not as a trophy but as a tool that should be sheathed before it becomes your only instrument. I told one story about a woman who orchestrated her ex-lover's reckoning, and then learned to invest in other kinds of change. I named her Sophia and then, halfway through, I named myself. The room didn't gasp. It exhaled. Truth behaves like that when it's properly ventilated. After, a young man with unsteady hands approached the mic during Q&A and asked, "How do you know when you've won?" "I don't," I said. "I know when I'm not losing myself. That's the metric." 14. The taper. I won't pretend the postcard was the last of it. A few skirmishes found me. Small men with large inboxes. Institutions allergic to mirrors. I dealt with them with economy and a lack of ornament. Some days I longed for the old burn. Some days I discovered I could choose tea instead. My students keep graduating into their own light. Adrian keeps writing sentences that feel like handrails. Mara's film premiered at a festival where no one asked whose niece was in it. Delphine sends me late-night photos of perfect installs and crooked donors. In the mornings, I unlock the community darkroom and the smell of fixer makes time stack neatly. I wash prints and watch an image appear in the tray, gray to black, like a truth you coax from water. There's a moment when you lift the paper and it drips and you know, if you leave it in longer, the blacks will choke the midtones. If you take it out too soon, the image will look like it's apologizing. The skill is not force. It's timing. It's knowing when enough is the right size. I used to think victory would feel like standing on a high place with my hair behaving like a flag. It doesn't. It feels like a room I can lock and unlock at will, a man in it who can bear both my quiet and my weather, and a table where my name isn't the only one that matters. When I sleep, I don't dream about Lucas. I dream about light, its small apostasies, its tender consistencies, the way it steals and gives. I wake with a calm I earned. If you need an ending, here is mine, for now. I keep a copy of the navy dress in my closet not as a relic but as a reminder. Objects don't hold power, choices do. On the inside hem, I stitched a single word with clumsy, private thread, enough. It doesn't mean settle. It means measure. It means I can stop when the image is true. My name is Sophia. I have been fragile and I have been precise. I have been a blade and a bomb. I once mistook survival for victory. I now know victory is the proportion of yourself you don't have to surrender. The handle of that old door is no longer warm. There are other rooms now, with windows that face east. And I've learned to open them before the day begins.